r/askreddit. What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? Was working the evening shift at a gas station. Man comes in all disoriented. I go to help him out. He has a gash on his head and doesn't know where he was. I couldn't see any crashes around, so assumed he had fallen or something. Normally we are supposed to stay inside the glass shielded register area whenever anyone is in the store. I, being a nice human being, went to help while calling the police EMS. They got there and checked him out. They thought his head may have been fractured. Took him to the ER. I went back to work. Cops stopped back by for some coffee a few hours later. They told me the guy got hit by a baseball bat trying to break into a little girl's bedroom and was wanted for rape and murder in 2 other states. I never left the register area at night again. The Lake Nyos disaster. The lake periodically belches a cloud of invisible carbon dioxide gas that suffocates everything within a 16-mile radius. In 1986, over 1,700 people and all their livestock died without even understanding what was happening to them. My science teacher in high school was in the Peace Corps and one of the first people to come across this village after it happened. He said it was so eerie because all the flies and mosquitoes had died and it was so silent. All the flies and mosquitoes had died. This scares me far more than the death of the people and livestock. Because no matter where you go, you always expect for at least one fly or mosquito to be there. But to find even those things dead. My god. John List killed his whole family, wife, mother, daughter and 2 sons. He meticulously planned the whole thing, cancelling all delivery services, excusing the kids from school, and even turned the air conditioning as low as possible to preserve the bodies for as long as possible. After he killed them all, he placed the bodies in sleeping bags and lined them up. He then wrote a letter to his pastor explaining why he had to kill them. He then leaves and isn't heard from again. 18 years later he's remarried and doing the same job as before, but this time he doesn't have any children. He's finally arrested after a tip was given to the FBI. Crazy thing is that because he planned it so well, the bodies weren't discovered until a month after the murders, so he had a huge head start and essentially started a new life in the same career and was heavily involved in a new church down in Virginia. Took 18 years to capture him. What did the letter say that he left? He pretty much explained that he killed his family to ensure their entry into heaven because he was worried they were straying from their faith. So in a way, he thought he was saving their souls. Killers like that are the scariest. He thought he had a noble reason, but in reality he was crazy. The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally raped her, and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed, and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. Edited to add, I was in a rush when I wrote this, so you should definitely read more into the story. It's crazy. From the horrific act itself, to the court proceedings, to the fact that he hardly served any time. What really upsets me most about this is that Singleton was released from jail for good behavior and went on to murder a different woman a few years later, Roxanne Hayes. One of my friends had someone following her home, hiding in the bushes so they couldn't be seen. She booked it to her house, got inside, and he was watching the house from the outside. She called the cops. They come along quietly and got the jump on him. He had condoms, handcuffs, and a knife. When they got his DNA, it turned out that he was linked to a half-dozen rapes in the area. She credits her regimen of running sprints to outrunning him that night and firmly believes she would have been raped if she couldn't outrun him then. Rule number 1, cardio. Rule number 2, double tap. Rule number 3, beware of bathrooms. An acquaintance of mine sent his son to triathlon camp in Texas. A week later, his son came back from camp. The next day, the son was complaining of a headache. 4 days later, he was dead. Healthy, happy, fit 12-year-old 1 week, dead the next. Turns out the lake had Naegleria fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba. Nothing scares me as irrationally as already being dead and waiting for your body to catch on. Naegleria is terrifying to me. You can get it just from getting water up your nose swimming in a lake, or, I've heard but I'm too lazy to check, there have been people who got it from using a neti pot. Yep, the amoeba needs to come into contact with the top of your nose, so you have to snort the water. Or, if you happen to live in Louisiana in 2013, they weren't using enough chlorine in the water supply, so people using neti pots with tap water were exposed. The good news is that the brain eaters really like specific conditions. They like very warm, ATF+, stagnant water with zero salt or chlorine. So even a little bit of chlorine or bromine is enough to protect yourself. In the US, only lakes in the South, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, etc. meet those conditions, and humans don't want to spend a lot of time in that water since it's usually pretty gross. Even then, you still have to get the water up your nose. Water skiing or jet skiing are the two common causes. Edit. Also cases in MN and AZ. Interestingly, there was a guy here who didn't ask me anything about a treatment. You just have to move quickly, because once a person loses their sense of smell, it's already over, because the amoeba have eaten your olfactory bulb, the part of your brain responsible for smelling. Then it continues eating, and eventually ends up at your brainstem, which controls things like breathing and heart rate. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other 3 sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits miles per hour. 2 of them died on impact and the only reason the third survived is because they crashed in front of a house that 2 doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the 60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town for months after to be a warning to all. That's terrifying. I missed a situation like this years ago. Was hanging out with a buddy at the bars and we leave to go back to his place for some smoke and video games. His roommate comes home from work, he was a bartender, and tells us he's heading out to the bars and asks if we want to go. He'll drive. We go back and forth but eventually decide to stay in. Turns out, the buddy had been drinking heavily at work, but we couldn't tell. He ended up flipping his Jeep off of an overpass and dropping 20+ feet. The entire back of his Jeep, where I would have been sitting, was crushed into the back of the front seat. The roll bar was smashed into the passenger side. Buddy ended up getting some serious brain injuries and spent the next few years learning how to walk and talk again. He's still pretty off and much different than he used to be. My other buddy and I came very close to a similar or worse fate. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with a carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming into 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself, and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. This sounds exactly like the story of There's Something Wrong with Aunt Diane, another real-life event where a woman drove a van full of children down the wrong way while being high on some drug before eventually hitting another car and killing herself and the kids. Really odd similarities between Judy Kirby and Diane Schuller's cases. Edit. Had forgotten the details of Diane's case, but she had apparently been horribly drunk. Empty handle of vodka found at the scene plus blood alcohol content twice the legal limit in autopsy, and had tested positive for THC in her system. If you like the video, please like and subscribe or the Boogeyman will find you.